What's going on, guys? In today's video, we're going to be weighing in on a technical dispute that occurred at the weekend there over Twitter between two of the game's absolute end bosses, Phil Galfond and Doug Polk. Phil tweeted out in his usual helpful manner. He often tweets advice for beginner and intermediate players to help them avoid pitfalls and things like that. Only this time, his tweet was met with fierce resistance from Doug Polk, who went so far as to call it bad advice. Who's right? Who's wrong? Whose side of the fence are we going to come down on? And what can we learn from this clash of the titans whenever two players as prolific as these two disagree? There's bound to be a ton of opportunity for us to improve our game by getting into it and dissecting the subject matter. Let's get going. Let's do it. So let's start out with the original quote. Phil Galfond said the following. So he's kind of quoting a recreational or amateur beginner poker player here saying, I am at the bottom of my range, so I have to bluff. And then Phil's coming back on this by saying, well, are you playing Linus Love or Berry Sweet? Heads up, these are two very well-known high-stakes online guys from the last few years. No, then you don't have to bluff. You should only bluff if you think it's more profitable than checking and losing. It's really that simple. What do we think of this quote, guys? Like, what do we think of this statement from Phil Galfond? Let me know in the comments what your initial reaction is. I would say that this is very clearly true. The statement that you should only bluff if you think it's more profitable than checking and losing is true. But I would add a giant caveat here, which is that it's very difficult to know when you're an amateur or aspiring poker player whether betting as a bluff is higher EV than checking with the bottom of your range. Now, there may be some really obvious cases that are just black and white where it's clearly better to check. For example, if you overbet the turn against a drunken maniac who snap called you on the turn, and then the river came and you've got a pot-sized bet left, you need 50% fold equity there to shove the bottom of your range, and it seems quite evident that you're not getting it in that spot. So in that hand, for example, I would totally agree with Mr. Galfond that you should not bluff the river there, because quite clearly what he's saying is factually correct. What he's doing here is he's making a hypothetical conditional clause. He's basically saying, if A, then B. And he's not saying A. He's not saying that you should always give up. He's just saying, if you don't think it's as good to bluff as it is to check, then you should check. And I don't think there's any arguing with that. However, I do think there are a few issues with this quote. But before I get to those issues, let me show you what Doug Polk said in response. So Doug said the following. These are clearly ridiculous AI-generated images of our protagonists here, guys. By the way, they're not photos or anything like that. Doug looks about 19 in this picture. I don't know if that's what he looked like at 19. Maybe he can comment on the comment section and let us know if that's an accurate depiction. But anyway, Doug riposted here by saying, just bad advice. Force yourself to bluff optimally and take what's yours. If they call, that's fine, print EV. Normalizing giving up is how you become a weak losing player. Suck it up and fire that final bullet. So this response, I feel, is not totally unwarranted. I think it's a little bit too far. To say that it's bad advice, let's take that claim first of all. So he's saying that Galfond's claim is bad advice. What would it mean for something to be bad advice? Could there be something that's true that's actually bad advice? I think you could have something that's true that's bad advice, first of all. So I don't think the fact that Galfond's claim is just like obviously true necessarily means that it's a good thing to say to aspiring poker players. And I think this might be where Doug is coming from here. So one objection, and I think the one that he's trying to make, is that many people who are learning the game, I'm sure like students of both Run It Once, where I used to make content, and Upswing Poker, where I've never made content and know less about, but I'm sure both of those sites have seen their fair share of students working with their coaches who have the common pitfall of being way too passive and just missing a bunch of mandatory bluffs. And I think it's way more common for students to miss mandatory bluffs than it is for them to make bad bluffs or make spewy bluffs. I think that's just like the way it is for most people coming up through the micro stakes and low stakes. So maybe what Doug's reacting to here is that Phil's advice, let's go back to that quote just for a second here so you can remember what it was. Phil Galfond's advice that you should only bluff if you think it's more profitable than checking. Well, it's kind of obviously true. Like, how do you rate the beginner poker player's ability to make sense of whether it's better to bet than it is to check? This depends on so many really complicated things. For example, the thing that Phil is maybe implying here, which is that GTO claims that if you're at the bottom of your range, you have to bluff. That's not actually universally true. There are some exceptional spots where when you're not at a range advantage, that's to say you're in like what we would call in the Carrot Poker School, a neutral or an unfavorable world for your range, like range versus range picture is not so good for you. It could actually be that the hands with no showdown value in your range, many of them have bad blockers, and what you don't want to do is bet a hand with negative blockers, meaning unblocking your opponent's calls, blocking their folds, in a situation where you don't have a big range advantage. You would never bluff a hand like that. So first off, it's not actually true even in game theory that you always have to bluff with the bottom of your range, but it is true in many cases. It's true in cases where the world is favorable for your range. As soon as you have a range advantage, then in theory, you should always bluff a hand with no showdown value. And there are lots of spots like that. And take it from me, I've coached a ton of micro stakes and low stakes players over the years. They miss those spots all the time and they do blunder and hemorrhage EV. So if there's a sense in which Doug can claim that this quote is bad advice, I think it's the sense that it's likely, unbeknownst to Phil, it's not his intention to cause harm to the people reading it, but what Doug is maybe implying is that it's likely that people reading that will be persuaded to give up in lots of spots, maybe remember the echo of that quote without really knowing how to judge a spot where the fold equity is really low, where you don't have enough fold equity to make betting as good as checking, and all you can really do is settle for 0 EV. Like, how can we trust the poker learner, the beginning player, even the intermediate player, to do a great job of ascertaining when that's true? If I have some sympathy with Doug's position here, which I think I do, it comes from the fact that maybe Phil's quote might accidentally empower really bad, lazy, inventive, exploitative thought processes, such as the famous, they never fold. They never fold. Man, I'm sick to the bone of hearing that thought process. That is one of the worst thought processes ever. And Phil Galfond knows which spots his opponents don't fold in, do fold in. He's got a really good sense of that. He's been playing poker for 15, 18 years, something like this. I don't know exactly how long. He's been playing poker for a very long time at the highest levels. He's seen it all. He has a great sense of that. And many of the people working under him, like his coaches that run it once, they'll have a good sense of that. And even like the more advanced students as well will have a really good sense of that. However, the beginning player, the 25NL, 10NL grinder, 5NL grinder, is not going to be able to pick up on that and may well think that there is way less fold equity than there is in many spots. One of the things I'll be working on this spring is making a video format of Grade E of the Carrot Poker School. This is a course that I've been teaching in a live seminar format for the past year or so, and it's a mass data-driven course where we actually look at which spots are overfolded, underfolded, overbluffed, underbluffed, right? That's basically what we're doing. And you'd be surprised, because another thing we do is we separate the pool between like regs, people with reg stats, and people with fish, VPIP, PFRs, and we look to see where is each subpopulation overfolding, underfolding. And there are so many spots where fish as a populace, like the recreational side of the pool, is actually overfolding dramatically. And I'd go one step further here and say that in many of the spots where you do have to bluff in theory with the bottom of your range, which are favorable-ish situations or maybe neutral situations where you have good blockers on the river, in those spots, it's very difficult for your opponents to over-defend. Because usually in spots where you have a big range advantage, your opponents have often reached that spot very capped. For example, if they have checked behind on the turn, and they're meant to check back a lot of flush draws, and a flush comes on the river, and maybe you have a few mandatory bluffs in your range there, they're probably even more mandatory if that's a logical possibility. It's not. But they're probably even higher EV. There's even more fold equity to those bluffs in the real world where people are too capped. So I'd say the main objection to Phil's point here is not that it's false or that it's like there's anything wrong with it. It's clearly just completely true. It's almost a tautology. It's so obvious. But I think the objection is that it could cause people to give up en masse in spots where they actually have really good fold equity, because it's super hard to just know whether it's better to bet than it is to check. So Doug's point is, don't try and figure that out when you're a beginning poker player. I think that's what he's really doing here. Doug's maybe just saying, if you can get good at theory and you can figure out which spots print money to bluff in, you should just bluff those first and foremost, instead of going down this whole rabbit hole where you may hallucinate a lack of fold equity where fold equity is actually abundant, or where you may get bogged down with like fake exploits. I think what students very often do is they make up reads where they don't actually have a good concrete read because they don't have a theoretical thought process. They just have this void, this kind of gaping hole where a thought process should be. And because they lack the nuts and bolts of poker theory, of GTO, what they're actually doing is inventing reads to justify their play. Like, oh, this guy is never folding. This pool is never folding here. Trust me, I should give up here. There's no fold equity here. This is largely false, and we know that from mass data. We know that from rational psychology. There's just a lot more fold equity in spots than you would think. So far, I'm kind of strongmanning Doug's point a little bit because I feel it comes across a bit. It comes across far too strong, to be totally honest. Doug's position here reads very much like we should just force ourselves to bluff in every spot where it's theoretically right, regardless of what we think exploitatively. And I think that's too far, but I think Galfond and Polk are actually, they're not a million miles away from each other in their sort of poker ethos, but they are a little bit apart on the spectrum of exploitative to GTO. Doug, for example, I think is like pretty much a GTO purist. He places a lot of emphasis on just the EV maximization, finding the right line, and tends to prioritize finding aggression where most humans don't. That's like definitely something that he holds in high regard. Galfond, on the other hand, he's not one to shirk the responsibility of understanding theory. He's done a lot of theoretical work, I believe, on PLO, which is his main game, and he definitely encourages the people who he teaches to and preaches to basically put theory first and build their exploits on top of that. Therefore, maybe the dangerous side of his quote is just that it kind of encourages the non-reliance on theory, basically. It's moving very much towards a kind of, don't play GTO, you can do so much better than that. And that is true in many spots, but I also think for the beginning player, neglecting that GTO foundation too soon in the process and trying to swim before you can walk, is that the expression, run before you can walk, trying to do too much exploitative stuff when you don't have the bedrock of theory upon which that should rest is actually quite dangerous. However, I think that you should be installing some exploitative awareness in your students from a fairly early point. There are spots, for example, that are like really chronically under-bluffed at lower stakes. I know that's not what we're talking about here, so maybe it's not so relevant, but there are definitely spots where you should make giant deviations towards over-defending and over-folding. There are loads of under-bluffed and over-bluffed spots in real life at low and micro stakes. You know, it's not that they never bluff. Some spots are massively over-bluffed. Some spots are massively under-bluffed. We've talked about that a lot in this channel. I talk about that a lot in the Carrot Poker School, which you can find on carrotcorner.com. And yeah, you have to be really alert to what those are. So definitely encouraging exploitative play at quite an early point. I think this is a good idea. So basically what I'm saying is we need to find some kind of balance here. I think one thing we could really do a better job in general of in poker is basically having the right lens, like having the right level of specificity when we're talking about a point. For example, the question of whether you have to bluff the bottom of your range, it depends on so many variables, and definitely the biggest one is just how well your range is doing against your opponent's range, in game theory at least. Then of course we have this other layer of exploitability, like is villain the drunken station who's just called a turnover bet, or is he just like a nitty 25 and L reg? Like these are chalk and cheese, they're very different. But yeah, I think we need more qualifiers. We need to say, what kind of world is our range in? We need to be aware of that. We need to ask, is there a really clear, distinct exploit available that's either based on like something you know from mass data in a spot about that relevant pool or subpool? Is it something that you know about an individual where you just really strongly picked up on the fact they're going to underfold, like fold less of their range than is optimal on that river spot? Or are we creating kind of like straw man reads to fill what would otherwise be like a solid thought process if we'd only just study theory and then learn which spots to be aggressive in, as maybe Doug is kind of indicating we should here? So I think what's happened here is that the median of Twitter, as it always does, has created more polarization than was actually appropriate or necessary in this case. I don't really think that Phil's point is that we should err on the side of giving up unless we know, or that we should say that giving up is the default thing to do or anything like that. I think he's just saying that, well, a concept that we talk a lot about at Carrot Corner, which is of course true EV. He's just saying that when the true EV, the EV in reality of bluffing, is less than the EV of checking, meaning it's negative and checking is 0, then you shouldn't bet with the bottom of your range. Definitely a fair point, but I take Doug's point that that could do a lot of harm because people are already trending too much on the side of giving up, not bluffing enough, and not studying enough, not learning where they absolutely have to bluff. I find it absolutely like mind-boggling and scary how limited the awareness is of some students when they first arrive on my doorstep, so to speak, of where they absolutely have to bluff in theory. Because when you miss that, we call that river blunder theorem in the Carrot Poker School. It's an absolutely monumental mistake. So I get why Doug is maybe tempted to say that although this might not be bad advice when taken literally, it may be good advice that leads to bad consequences. So in a sense, maybe you could make the argument that it's bad advice, but I don't think that's at all what Phil's trying to do. I think, like, to depolarize this whole discussion and get to the truth here, we could say that having the theoretical foundation to understand where fold equity in game theory is higher than the break-even point where you have to bluff in game theory, that's port of call number one. You should always put that first, and you should have awareness of how range favorability works, how blockers work, and how those things dictate whether or not you should bluff. However, you shouldn't stop there. Once you've got a good sense of that, it's really important to say, is there a clear and distinct reason for which I think this spot is very underfolded? And if so, yeah, start backing off, start checking back a bit more, giving up, settling for 0 EV. You know, don't run into the burning building just because running into the burning building is the only way to get your phone back out. Just settle for the loss of the phone. But don't posit that where it's not the case. Equally, be very sure if you're going to make a big deviation from the theory that you've spent so much time studying and learning, and you're going to say no thanks to a bluff that works really well theoretically and maybe against pool, have a concrete read. Make sure that's not just they never bluff. I actually think there's less disagreement between these two here than would automatically be apparent. I know it wasn't a massive poker drama, it wasn't like a heated debate, but I think it raises a lot of really interesting points about bluffing. I'll segue just for a second here into a tale about a Twitter post that I actually made, and I don't have an AI generated version of myself because I'm not famous enough for the AI to know who I am. It's just like error, Pete Clark's not a thing when I put it into AI. It's actually really sad. I better stop thinking about it. But one thing I tweeted a few weeks ago was that when you have no showdown value and you're at the absolute, you just can't win by checking, and your range is doing really well, then in theory you should bluff. And I think that's a really key starting point. A lot of people don't understand that. I got a load of pushback where people were like, but you shouldn't bluff busted flush draws, they're bad. And it's like, yeah, they're bad in neutral or unfavorable worlds where your fold equity is not that high, but when your base fold equity in Pio Solver, you know, in game theory, is 15% more than it needs to be for you to break even, the blockers swing it by a few percent. They don't swing it enough to make that hand a check back unless that hand has a significant portion of showdown value. So I made this point, a lot of people didn't get it. So maybe we shouldn't be starting off here by debating, do you follow through with your bluffs or not? Are you allowed to deviate or not? These questions are a bit too crude. Maybe we need to educate people about how range versus range really affects us here, how action sequences, board textures, and pre-flop starting ranges all work together to create the favorability of the environment for your range, and that's the biggest factor. I'll leave you with that thought. Engage specifically, don't be too vague. Both of these guys know an absolute shit ton about poker. They're phenomenal players. I hope I've been able to mediate in some useful way here, even if neither of them ever watches this. If you like what we do, you like the way I think about the game, check out Carrot Corner for all of our paid content, and I will see you guys on another video very soon. Bye for now.